Let us gavel in and begin. As this hearing is fully virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters for today's meeting. The chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice when you are recognized that you have not unmuted yourself, I may ask the staff to send you a request to unmute yourself. Please then accept that request so that you are no longer muted. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there is a technology issue, we will move to the next member until that issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen. Make sure you're in gallery view. The clock will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members their time is almost up. And when your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of speaking order, we will begin with the chair and ranking member, then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. And the subcommittee will now come to order. Good afternoon. Welcome to the first hearing of the year for the Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science and related agencies. I am pleased to welcome our Attorney General Merrick Garland back to speak to us on the fiscal year 2023 budget request for the Department of Justice. Attorney General Garland, it has been a very busy year for you since our last meeting, and we look forward to discussing the major priorities for the Department of Justice. As we noted last year, the Justice Department's missions are far-reaching. The department helps administer the law and support the Constitution, protect national security, human rights, preserve civil liberties, support free and fair elections, and safeguard our commerce and our economy. The Department of Justice administers a massive, complex detention and correction enterprise. It adjudicates immigration benefits and oversees a broad and sophisticated criminal investigative and prosecutorial system. In addition to its traditional and ongoing missions, Justice is taking on new work to support our national response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine with the help of new funding Congress provided in last month's Ukraine supplemental. DOJ is carrying out its largest and unprecedented investigation and prosecution effort into the January 6th insurrection and related events. And while DOJ is adjusting to the arc of the COVID-19 pandemic, it must also ensure that billions in essential pandemic assistance funding are not lost to fraud. Now, the department's task is to ensure that a constitution rooted in 18th century enlightenment can safely negotiate 21st century headwinds. And we hope this committee can help ensure that you are equipped with a 21st century toolkit to navigate those winds. To carry out the department's broad missions, your budget seeks $38.7 billion in discretionary funding, about 11.3% above the fiscal year 2022 enacted level. Now, your budget proposes significant funding to strengthen the response to a concerning national epidemic in opioid overdoses and a surging gun violence. It also seeks resources to address a concerning and historic threat from violent extremists, particularly white supremacists. We hope to discuss these both in greater detail. As the Bureau of Prisons begins to come out of the pandemic, we expect to learn how it is improving its staffing, reducing overcrowding, and implementing the First Step Act reforms using the substantial investments provided by Congress. We also want to hear how the department would utilize the significant increases that are sought for the Office on Violence Against Women, juvenile justice programs, and efforts to strengthen community policing. This administration has proposed a $595 million or 78% increase for the Executive Office for Immigration Review to address significant immigration processing backlogs. We expect to learn more about how the department can help make our immigration system work in the face of an unprecedented workload. Now, you have taken steps to identify corruption and capture Russian kleptocrats, or at least their ill-gotten wealth. We're going to want to learn more today about the progress in that effort. We also look to hear more about the proposed initiatives to bolster antitrust enforcement, support environmental justice, and defend intellectual property rights to protect American industry and jobs. Attorney General Garland, you have a big job that is only getting bigger. Now, we look forward to your testimony. And at this time, I want to turn to my distinguished ranking member, Mr. Robert Aderholt, for his statement. Mr. Aderholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Attorney General. It is we welcome you to the Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee today to testify regarding the Department of Justice FY23 budget request. Of course, your budget request has a total of roughly $38 billion in discretionary resources for the Department of Justice, which is an increase of over $2.5 billion over FY22 enacted level. But for reasons that are not really clear, your budget proposes an additional $30 billion. And for those who are listening, that is with the B, billion in new mandatory spending. The budget submission includes no explanation of how Congress is expected to fulfill this request. What this request signals is that while American families all across the United States are making hard choices, they're seeing their buying power diminish with each passing day, the administration is doubling down on spending policies that have helped bring about the worst inflation that this nation has seen really in 40 years. And while taxpayers are stretching to make every dollar they retain count, the budget boasts about including $600 million in support free immigration lawyers for thousands of illegal persons who are crossing the border to illegally enter our country each and every day. Even more outrageous is the fact that $450 million is mandatory spending. Speaking of immigration, Attorney General Garland, I have many questions about the cost of the immigration policies you have helped craft. In particular, a new asylum rule that abdicates the role of immigration courts funded by this subcommittee and diminishes the value and the integrity of immigration judges, as it trades integrity for expediency and puts the politics really ahead of border security. This rule, an interim final rule announced in March, turns our immigration system literally on its head. It shifts the burden of filing illegals' application for asylum to the U.S. government. It redirects unauthorized aliens from a path to removal proceedings to non-adversarial hearings in which asylum can be granted expeditiously. And it creates the strongest magnet yet for illegal immigration, an expedited path to a work authorization. The new procedures that are set forth go into effect May 31st, and it is set to collide with the administration's repeal of Title 42 procedures. Yet ironically, we will no doubt hear today that the Justice Department is committed to countering the surge of violent crime that our nation is experiencing, and that it wants to combat the human and drug trafficking operations of violent cartels. This committee and the American people have a right to hear whether the request for federal law enforcement resources in this budget reflects the surge in migration and crime that is expected to result from major policy changes that this administration is poised to unleash. In addition, I've got some questions that I will go over today about DOJ's baffling decision to terminate the China initiative. FBI Director Christopher Wray has repeatedly sounded the alarm about the threats that the United States face from China. And he is correct on that. The biggest threat we face as a country from a counterintelligence perspective is the Chinese Communist Party. And according to Director Wray, they have stolen more of Americans' personal and corporate data than every nation combined. Anything that makes an industry tick, they have targeted it. And we need to know why this administration, rather than working to counter false political charge that the program was targeting Chinese people or people of Chinese ancestry, simply terminated this essential national security program. In your prepared testimony, you state that the department places a high priority on countering nefarious activities from hostile nation states like China, like Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And with all due respect, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are nefarious actors, but we know the difference. China presents an existential and generational threat. Finally, I'm concerned about the excessive level of federal spending by this administration. Inflation is at the highest level since 1981, and yet the president's budget proposes increases in both taxes and spending, which will likely grow inflation even higher than we're seeing today. Inflation is a tax on everyone. President Biden continues to blame inflation on everything except a failed economic agenda. I would argue that this budget proves that the administration has not learned from its mistakes. Our nation's staggering debt, along with increasing interest rates, will diminish future generations' economic opportunities, and it will hinder the federal government's ability to address the security needs of the country. Nevertheless, I believe that there will be opportunities to find some agreement on measures to reduce violent crime, also to fight the scourge of addiction, and to protect the vulnerable from those who would seek to abuse or exploit them. In closing, I do appreciate the hard work of you, Mr. Attorney General, and your staff at the Department of Justice to help keep Americans safe. I stand by to work with you and to ensure that the programs you administer are not only effective, but they're as efficient as possible, but also that they support the rule of law. And I look forward to working with Chairman Cartwright, who has been a great partner on this subcommittee in support of funding for many important missions of the Department of Justice as this year's appropriation process moves forward. And again, I do appreciate your willingness to be before the subcommittee today, and I yield back. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Adderholt. At this time, Mr. Attorney General, you are recognized for your opening remarks. Please try to keep your statement to 5 minutes. And as always, be assured that your full written statement will be included in the record. You're recognized.
Good afternoon, Chairman Cartwright, Ranking Member Adderholt, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. Before I address the details of our fiscal year 2023 request, I would like to say a word about the President's supplemental budget request with respect to Ukraine. The Justice Department is currently putting all available resources to use to hold accountable individuals whose criminal actions are enabling Russia's unjust war against Ukraine. In March, we launched the Klepto-Capture Task Force. Since then, the task force has been hard at work with our international partners to enforce sanctions violations, dismantle Russian criminal networks, and freeze, seize, and forfeit kleptocrat assets. The proposals the President announced today will give the Justice Department critical resources and tools to continue and strengthen this work. Among other things, they would enable us to transfer the proceeds of forfeited Russian assets directly to Ukraine to remedy the harms of Russia's aggression. They would close loopholes in our sanctions and forfeiture law, and they would allow us to help the people of Ukraine in their most dire hour. We have all seen the heartbreaking images coming out of Ukraine, and we have all read the accounts of Russia's brutality. We urge Congress to quickly consider this request. The Justice Department stands ready to provide the committee with additional details and assistance as you consider the administration's supplemental request. With that, I'll turn to the primary subject of today's hearing, the Justice Department's FY23 budget request. Over the 413 days that I have served as Attorney General, 3 co-equal priorities have guided the work of the Justice Department: keeping our country safe, protecting civil rights, and upholding the rule of law. These priorities reflect the Justice Department's mission, and our mission is reflected in the President's FY23 budget request. Our first request and our first funding priority is keeping our country safe from all threats, foreign and domestic, whether from hostile nation states, terrorists, or common criminals. As our country's chief law enforcement officer, I'm committed to supporting members of law enforcement at all levels of government as they work to protect our country, while also safeguarding civil liberties and ensuring our accountability to the American people. To these ends, the President's FY23 budget requests more than $20.2 billion to support the work of DOJ's law enforcement components and U.S. attorneys' offices as they carry out their complex mission sets. These resources will strengthen the Justice Department's efforts to reduce violent crime and gun violence, to counter the multitude of serious and evolving threats to our country from terrorists, cyber criminals, and hostile nation states, to combat the violent drug trafficking networks that are fueling our nation's overdose epidemic, and to protect our nation's democratic institutions, including the one that you are sitting in today, from violent attack. In FY23 alone, the President's budget also requests more than $8 billion in grants for states and localities nationwide to fund the police, including by funding more police officers for the beat and by implementing community-based strategies to prevent crime and gun violence. The President's FY23 budget also prioritizes the protection of civil rights. We are seeking a 32% increase in funding for the Civil Rights Division, as well as additional resources for our U.S. attorneys, the FBI, the Community Relations Service, and our Office for Access to Justice. Our civil rights work remains vital to safeguarding voting rights, prosecuting hate crimes, ensuring constitutional policing, and addressing unlawful discrimination. Another area of departmental focus is safeguarding economic security, fairness, and opportunity. This is reflected in our request for resources to protect the American people from intellectual property crimes, to reinvigorate our antitrust enforcement and consumer protection, to combat corporate crime, to bring to justice those who seek to profit unlawfully from the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, the department requests a total of $273 million, an increase of 41.6% for the Antitrust Division to carry out its critical mission of promoting competition in the American economy and protecting workers, consumers, and businesses alike. Finally, we are requesting $11.7 billion to ensure the just administration of our nation's immigration courts and federal correctional systems. This includes $1.35 billion for the Executive Office for Immigration Review to reduce the immigration court backlog by hiring more than 1,200 new staff, including approximately 200 immigration judge teams over the FY22 enacted level. Our request for $8.18 billion for the Bureau of Prisons will help ensure the health, safety, and well-being for the more than 150,000 individuals in federal custody. This request would allow BOP to hire 1,300 new correctional officers and First Step Act staff, and would be used to support rehabilitative programming and improve conditions for confinement. I respectfully ask for your support for our budget requests as the Justice Department works to uphold the rule of law, keep our country safe, and protect everyone's civil rights. Thank you.
Thank you for that statement, Attorney General Garland. We're going to begin the question period now. Each of us will have 5 minutes per round. And I'm going to begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes of questions. I want to start with what's news today. You mentioned in your opening statement about the establishment of Task Force Klepto Capture. Klepto, of course, is a $50 word that refers to stealing. Is that correct?
By persons affiliated with nation state autocrats. Yes, that's fair to say.
So Task Force Klepto Capture is to enforce measures to target oligarchs and other criminal allies whose resources have helped enable Russia to amass corrupt wealth and support its military aggression. We just now received the administration's new Ukraine supplemental request, and that's the news. In that request, $67 million is proposed to be provided to the Department of Justice under its general administration account to support that task force, specifically in its efforts to seize high-value assets from sanctioned individuals and use the proceeds and assets seized to remediate harm caused in Ukraine by the Russian invasion. Now, the first and most important question I have is $67 million. Attorney General Garland, is that enough to do the job?
Well, I always like to get that question from an appropriations subcommittee. Look, you did give us $59.4 million in the first supplemental, which we put to use for the Klepto Capture task force and also for our concerns about cyber attack. This $67 million is more funding. We would obviously appreciate your support for it because it will allow us to carry forward our current operations. But we do anticipate, that is, our task force anticipates at least 30 complex investigations over time. So we would, of course, welcome any additional resources and would be able to put them to good use.
Well, specifically, asset forfeiture is an expensive undertaking. And there are asset forfeiture efforts going on right now. How much are you spending on the beefed up asset forfeiture efforts now? And what kinds of expenses would this new request support?
Well, this request would support our asset forfeiture abilities. So when you seize and freeze, I think you're alluding to, you do have to maintain the assets until we're able to forfeit them. So some part of this money would allow us to maintain the assets until we're able to sell them, pay back the money for maintenance, and then send the balance to Ukraine.
Now, Mr. Attorney General, do you require, under the law, additional authority to make proceeds available to fund Ukraine assistance rather than have those funds tied up in the asset forfeiture fund?
Yes, we do, and that's one of the one of the proposals in the administration's supplemental. Right now, the asset forfeiture fund does not easily allow us to transfer money for that purpose. but this would allow us to do that.
Okay, well, we'll be in touch with you about that. Now, I want to broaden the discussion just a little bit. In the past decade, there have been spectacular successes by whistleblowers and investigative reporters, such as those in the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the Pandora Papers. It's no secret that Russian oligarchs represent only a small subset of the kinds of global corruption we're talking about that could be of interest to law enforcement. Does this klepto capture task force offer a new model for addressing those kinds of investigations that could uncover broader criminal enterprises engaged in things like money laundering, trafficking, and even national security threats?
Yes, I think it can. I want to be clear that our initial focus now has to be on the Russian oligarchs and the sanctions against them. But the kind of task force we've established, which cuts across all departments of the United States government, Treasury, Homeland Security, various inspector generals, and our own prosecutors, is putting together the kind of data to uncover these shell companies that you're referring to. And the more experience we have in this area, the easier it will be to apply the model to this kind of behavior across the board.
I'm glad to hear you say that, and I look forward to working with you on that as well. At this time, I will yield to the ranking member, Mr. Adderholt, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question, I want to ask about a situation that occurred in early April. There were photos of 5 deceased babies that were allegedly from the Washington Surgical Clinic and here in Washington, D.C., and it captured national headlines. It appeared that these fully formed babies had died in abortions. The pictures reveal the brutality of abortion, and especially late-term abortions. And I'm very concerned about the allegation that at least one baby may have died in a partial birth abortion in violation of federal law. To my knowledge, these babies have received no official autopsy to determine whether a violation of the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act of 2003 or the Born Alive Infants Protection Act of 2002 had occurred. The facts are troubling to the extent that I think they at least warrant an investigation. And since what is alleged is a violation of federal law, that places the matter under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Department of Justice. What my question would be, will you commit to dedicating appropriate personnel from the Department of Justice and the FBI to investigate whether any of these babies died in violation of a federal law?
So my understanding is there is an investigation ongoing, led initially by the Metropolitan Police Department. Of course, the way federal and DC are organized, that would include assistant attorneys who are part of the Justice Department. I can't really say any more now because there's a pending investigation on it. But I believe the investigation has been announced publicly.
Oh, have you been able to view any of the photos of the evidence?
I really don't want to, since there's a pending investigation, I really don't think it's appropriate for me to discuss the way in which the investigation is proceeding.
Well, are you committed to enforcing 18 USC 1531, which is the partial birth abortion ban, which is settled law and is upheld by the Supreme Court? The department is committed to enforcing all federal laws. Okay, thank you. Well, thanks, and we look forward to following up and as that investigation continues. As I noted in my opening statement, the China initiative was a policy that was created under President Trump in 2018, and it was in response to the existential threat posed by the Chinese government and those acting on the behalf of the Chinese government. These efforts were always focused on the action of the Chinese Communist Party and their agents, never on the Chinese people or individuals of Chinese descent. My question would be, Attorney General, Director Wray frequently mentions that the Bureau is opening new cases to counter Chinese intelligence operations every 12 hours. How does this workload compare to threats that are emanating from Russia, North Korea, and Iran?
Well, it's a little hard to quantify. I think that all four of those countries represent significant threats to the United States, but they're along different threat vectors. I think what Director Wray recently said on CBS 60 Minutes, all of which I agree with, is that the Chinese government, the Communist Party, poses an enormous threat to our intellectual property, to our cyber systems, with respect to counterintelligence, and with respect to the national interest in those ways. No one looking at Ukraine right now can doubt that the Russian government also poses an enormous threat to the United States. We are bracing for potential cyber attack from Russia. We've had numerous criminal cyber attacks, which we've associated with criminal actors operating within Russia. No one operates in Russia without at least some support or looking away by the government there. We face a counterintelligence threat from Russia as well. So that's enormously significant. Everyone on this committee is aware of the Iranian threat and their support for terrorist organizations, which we have to be very concerned about as well. And of course, North Korea is a threat on a number of areas, one of which is again, cyber and cyber theft. So I think all four of these countries that you mentioned all represent substantial threats to the national security. And we are focused on combating every one of them.
Thank you. And of course, but obviously, what we're seeing from China is very disconcerting. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt. At this time, the chair recognizes the overall chair of House Appropriations, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. And Mr. Attorney General, it is wonderful to see you, and I thank you for your testimony today. As you know, far too many families and communities across the nation face really very heartbreaking tragedies and a needless loss of life, which is caused by this epidemic of gun violence and the lack of gun safety safeguards. So I want to say a thank you to you for the focus you brought to the issue, as well as the priorities that are outlined in this year's bequest, including the $1 billion for DOJ's gun violence prevention efforts. This is a personal issue for me and the district that I represent. In 2018, Ethan Song, a 15-year-old teenager from Guilford, Connecticut, had his life cut short after being shot with an unsecured gun. Ethan's story is tragic, but sadly has become a common reality for too many families. I have legislation, and it's legislation that is passed in the Connecticut State Legislature. Ethan's Law is called Ethan's Law. It's supported by more than 200 of my House colleagues, and it is to set federal standards for safe gun storage. I'm hoping that the House will soon take it up and pass it, which is much needed legislation. But while we pursue this congressional action, the efforts taken by your administration in the meantime are critically important. Can you explain your current work, how the resources included in this request will help curb the epidemic of gun violence, protect children and communities across the nation? And without the Congress at the moment, how does this Ethan's Law, this kind of legislation, fit into the administration's agenda?
Well, we are asking for $20.2 billion, which is a 8.2% increase for law enforcement and U.S. attorneys' offices to fight violent crime and gun violence. This includes an increase in 757 assistant U.S. attorneys to put federal statutory penalties on gun violence and to investigate, to run the kinds of task forces of state, federal, and local law enforcement necessary to most effectively do this. We've asked for a $605 million increase for the FBI to fight a number of areas, which includes $20.6 million for violent crime and $6.2 million for expanded NICS background checks. We have in our request $173 billion, which is a $201 million increase for ATF, to expand the number of agents so that we can expand our gun trafficking strike forces. Last year, we introduced 5 gun trafficking task forces to interdict the pipeline of guns that go north and south on the east and the west coast, and through the center of the country, focused on Chicago. This would allow us to expand those. It would also improve the National Tracing Center and the NIBIN Center that ATF runs. And then we've asked for quite a lot of money, an additional $5.48 billion for grants to state and local communities and law enforcement to prevent gun and violence and to enforce those laws.
In the context of what you were just talking about, of grants, et cetera, what Ethan's law essentially says is that individuals have to secure their guns. They can secure it with ammunition, but the weapon has to be secured. It is a public health issue. This is not, we're not trying to take anyone's guns away from them. We're not, it is very simply store the weapon and the ammunition in a safe place. And so that it's not accessible to kids, because we're seeing increased number of kids who are dying, through an accidentally. And just the concept of this, as I say, it's passed the state legislature in Connecticut, bipartisan support, overwhelming bipartisan support. So again, it is about gun storage. Does that fit into your agenda with regard to the gun safety safeguards and the $1 billion in the gun violence prevention effort? Is this something that would fit into your structure?
So I have to consult our experts as to whether the existing grant programs cover that. They may, I just don't know. Okay. As you no doubt know, we did have model red flag laws that we put out with help with respect to grants for state legislatures that were interested in that. It might be the similar program, but I don't know. But I will ask our technical staff to speak with your staff.
Okay, I much appreciate it. I much appreciate the initiative on gun violence prevention, and it is overwhelming. And as I say, the issue that I'm speaking about is purely and simply a public health issue. It doesn't remove anyone's guns. It doesn't. The restriction is to make it safe, get it into a safe storage place. So thank you very, very much, and Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you for the opportunity to speak at the hearing today. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Chair DeLauro. At this time, the chair recognizes Representative Ben Klein for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Attorney General for joining us today. General Garland, over the last 2 years, the CDC has exercised enormous power, including power to shut down the cruise ship industry, stop landlords from evicting tenants who have not paid their rent, require that persons using public transportation wear masks. Since the Justice Department has decided to appeal the case in support of the administration's authority to implement these mask mandates, I'd like to understand your basis for the belief that the CDC was acting within the scope of its authority. Given that the authority of the Public Health Services Act, which is allegedly the basis for the government mask mandates, has generally been limited to quarantining infected individuals and prohibiting the import or sale of animals known to transmit diseases. Is it the administration's interpretation that mandatory masking is a form of sanitation, and how so?
So as you correctly note, Congressman, this is a matter in litigation. The precise wording that you mentioned, sanitation, is one of the issues in that litigation. I just want to be clear what the Justice Department's role here is. It's the CDC that makes the public policy and public health determinations. And our only role is to determine whether it has statutory authority. We have taken that position now for quite some time, that it has statutory authority for the masking with respect to interstate transportation. The analysis is laid out in the briefs that we filed in numerous courts on this subject.
Well, not only did the judge rule that the CDC went beyond its authority, they also found that they violated the APA in the process of implementing this mask mandate. As you know, back in February of 2021, when they published the mask mandate without allowing public participation through notice and comment procedures as the basis for dispensing with the ordinary APA requirements, the CDC said that it would be impracticable and contrary to the public's health to delay the mandate to seek public comment. So I think that we have several problems with the mandate that was put in place. Do you know, General Garland, excluding the last 2 years, when this authority that they're claiming was last enforced and what the purpose of it was?
So I don't know the history. I imagine it was discussed in the litigation. Of course, this is the first major pandemic the country has suffered since the flu epidemic at the beginning of the 20th century. But I could get back to you on what the history has been with some of my staff, if you'd like.
Well, it's been rare. In fact, from the decision, I'm just looking at page 29, the provision has rarely been invoked and never before to justify a mandate that travelers on every form of commercialized travel wear masks. And perhaps the most notable use of the statute so far, excluding the last 2 years, of course, was a decision to ban small turtles due to a risk of salmonella back in 1975. So I think what we're seeing here is a broad misinterpretation of the statute and a misapplication, not to mention the failure to follow the APA in the process. So I would hope that the Justice Department would reconsider that decision. Let me move on to another subject. American citizens and legal immigrants are, in civil cases, not entitled to free legal representation, correct?
Yes, as a general matter, that's right, although many states have different rules in that respect, but that is correct.
But federal, from a federal perspective, not in family court, not in tax court, not in bankruptcy proceedings, correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
And as you would probably agree, legal representation can be expensive. An American can lose their children or their life savings or become homeless without the government paying for their attorneys. But it's my understanding in your budget request, you're requesting $600 million a year to pay for attorneys for unauthorized aliens. Is that correct?
So the Legal Services Corporation, with funding for Congress, does also provide money for the states for all the kinds of things that you're talking about: small claims court, tax court, bankruptcy court, landlord-tenant court. We do have a tradition of trying to provide money for legal services for the poor.
Back to this line of questioning in the next round. At this time.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I go back.
Chair recognizes Representative Grace Meng for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, thank you for being here. I am grateful that the fiscal year 23 budget request includes $3.2 billion in discretionary resources for state and local grants. in addition to funds to support law enforcement, crime prevention, and community violence intervention. As you know, I helped secure $5 million in the fiscal year 22 omnibus for a new grant program to go to community-based organizations and civil rights groups who are providing services to victims of hate crimes. These organizations are working at the local level to prevent and counter the proliferation of hate crimes and bias incidents. Over the past few years of the pandemic, the critical work of local organizations in helping prevent hate crimes and assist those left in their wake have been proven repeatedly in my district. I'm concerned that we are not engaging community organizations and local efforts in the administration of these larger grant programs to prevent violence and crime. Are there ways that we can ensure that community-based organizations have equitable access to the discretionary grants that Department of Justice administers? And where are areas that it can improve collaboration with community-based organizations?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the legislation, which we are very much supportive of. So we are asking for $20 million in Office of Justice Program grants, which would go to state and local law enforcement, but also to community organizations for the investigation and prosecution and for community engagement and outreach, which I take it are some of the things that you're talking about. For example, providing state hotlines for hate crimes and hate incidents. So this general concept is included in the money that's we're requesting for grants.
Thank you. And if there are any ways that our office can be helpful in reaching out to even more community-based organizations, please let me know. The other question I have is about an issue that I've been working on for many years. It's the issue of period poverty or lack of access to affordable menstrual products. An opinion piece published in the Washington Post last month highlighted some horrifying stories of incarcerated women being forced to trade favors with the guards in exchange for menstrual products, and stories of prison staff withholding products as a form of intimidation or punishment in state and local facilities. Not only are these reports damning, it is completely unacceptable that such practices occur in our carceral system. No one should face abuse in order to access a basic necessity. I know the special litigation section of your department has investigated a few facilities for violating the civil rights of incarcerated women under the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act. Are there additional resources needed to support the work of the special litigation section or the Division on Civil Rights to ensure that we are protecting their civil rights?
So if I could talk separately about the federal side of this with respect to Bureau of Prisons and then with respect to the state and local side. On the federal side, there is a statute which requires provision of free female hygiene products, and BOP endeavors to do that. There are site visits to ensure that is occurring. On the other side that you began to talk about in the second half of your question about the Institutionalized Persons Act, that is a object of focus of the Civil Rights Division. And so the 32.4% increase in funds that we've requested for the Civil Rights Division would enable resources to go across the board for the division, but including in the area that you're talking about.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Garcia from California for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Attorney General Garland, for your service to our beautiful nation. I was looking forward to having some detailed questions regarding this budget and the nuances of it and where we're going as an appropriator. That's what I'd like to spend my time. I'll put those through formal correspondence because, frankly, something you said in your written testimony in your opening statement really kind of disturbed me, and I want to talk about that a little bit. But I want to start first by just reading the mission statement that's on your DOJ website. It says that you are to enforce the law and defend the interests of the United States according to the law, to ensure public safety against threats, foreign and domestic, to provide federal leadership in preventing and controlling crime, to seek justice for those guilty of unlawful behavior. What disturbed me in your opening statement, your written testimony, there's a line in here where you said that I am pleased with the progress that the department has made since I appeared before you last June. And I can't wrap my brain around why you would be pleased with what's gone on in the last, call it, year to 18 months. In the last year, we've seen crime spikes like we've never seen before. 54% increase in shoplifting, 43% increase in police officers shot around this country in the line of duty, 59% increase in officers killed since 2021. 80% of Americans report that they are concerned about the crime and violence. Homicides nationally increased by 5% in 2021 when compared to 2020. That number is 44% compared to 2019. Gun assaults jumped 8%. 12 cities nationwide broke annual homicide records in 2021, and car thefts rose by 14%. I don't know what is pleasing about that progress. In addition to the crime rates, we're seeing record inflation approaching 9% now and a budget increase of only 6%, which is effectively defunding our law enforcement agencies and the grants we give them. You dissolved a couple of months ago, inexplicably, this China initiative that allows the US government through the DOJ to prosecute China's espionage, cyber security threats, as well as their IP theft. They are currently stealing roughly $400 billion to $600 billion of IP from the United States in its aggregate in terms of economic impact to our businesses. Yet the DOJ dissolved the China initiative. I don't understand what's pleasing about that. We have an executive branch and a president who is effectively opening our southern borders, looking to revoke Title 42, has already revoked in principle the Remain in Mexico policies that were instated in the last administration. And this is literally leading to the deaths of Americans nationwide with this national fentanyl problem and this record-breaking rate of deaths as a result of this fentanyl coming across our southern border. This last week, we saw Texas National Guardsman Bishop Evans killed while trying to save an illegal immigrant who was smuggling drugs into our country. I don't know why you're pleased about this progress. I want you to explain that if you can, but I also just don't understand. This is all inexplicable and inexcusable to me. What is, in your opinion, if this is good progress, what is the biggest threat to the United States right now?
Look, the enormous increase in violent crime, which began in 2020 before we came into office, is enormously concerning to me. And that is why, as soon as I did come into office, we developed a major strategy to fight violent crime, which focuses very heavily on our joint task forces with state and locals who are responsible at the first level for every kind of violent crime you described. That is the reason that we have asked each year for more money for grants for state and local law enforcement to fight that violent crime, and with our assistance at the federal level. So we're asking for $8.2 billion in grants for the police to be able to do that. And we're asking for $20.2 billion for our own federal law enforcement on that regard. That's what I'm pleased about, the way in which we are reorganizing ourselves to fight this terrible violent crime threat. It's not correct that we've dissolved our attacks, our response to China. Quite the opposite. We've stepped them up. We're asking for even more money for counterintelligence and cyber defense. But we are worried not only about China, but about Russia and about its immediate threat to us, and about North Korea and about Iran. All of the things that you are concerned about China, I remain concerned about. Nothing in our program reflects a diminution in that.
I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. And at this time, the chair recognizes Congressman Case of Hawaii for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Attorney General, thank you. I wanted to follow up on your your notation that your budget includes reinvigorating antitrust enforcement. As you know, this issue is top of mind to many in Congress. My observation is there's a heck of a lot of different perspectives on it, ranging from we don't have a problem to we have a severe problem with both our laws and with enforcement. And I guess I wanted to explore your views on that because, frankly, I'm trying to sort it through myself. But you have asked in your budget for a huge increase in antitrust enforcement of 41.6%. I mean, I guess, first of all, I don't see any other part of your budget which asks for an increase of that scope. I mean, is that generally correct? Is this one of the largest percentage increases anywhere in your budget?
I'd have to look over the whole budget to tell you that, but this clearly is a large increase, and I'll be happy to explain why. Over the last 4 or even more years, the Antitrust Division has been depleted. We actually, I think, have fewer lawyers in the Antitrust Division than we had in the 1970s. On the other hand, we're facing an enormously increased number of mega mergers, each one of which takes enormously sophisticated and complicated analysis, requires skilled lawyers, but also requires IT at a level that we've never had before. So $38.5 million of the request is for IT, so that we can come into the 21st century in our ability to analyze these mergers. And $27.4 million, which is an increase of 112 attorneys for antitrust enforcement. I'll tell you, when I came in, I was shocked to learn that the only way we were able to cover the investigations that we were doing was by hiring 2-year lawyers, 2 years at a time. I can tell you that the companies we are investigating and going to trial against are not hiring 2-year lawyers. They are hiring the best of the best from Wall Street, and we need to have lawyers who can match that. And we need to have as many lawyers as we can. So it looks like a large increase, but it's from a very small base.
And I'm just reading your testimony here. Not only are you down lawyers, but it says here in your testimony that you have nearly 400 fewer staff today than 1979. I mean, that's kind of shocking to me. And frankly, I don't think you can, if it's a time span of 1979 to present, I don't think you can get into what administration did what. It seems to have been a systematic depletion of antitrust. And I guess my obvious question there is, well, why was that? I mean, presumably companies were getting larger. I think it's fair to say that we have seen more mergers and an accelerating rate. We've seen much more complicated companies. We've seen much more complicated mergers. And it would seem to me that if we were realistic about our antitrust law enforcement, we would have kept up with that. And yet we seem to have gone in exactly the wrong direction on it. I mean, why is that? And I guess a corollary to that is it would seem to me that companies are pretty actively taking advantage of the fact that justice is forced to be highly selective in terms of the antitrust enforcement that it chooses just because of the lack of resources.
So I think you make a very fair point, which is this really is not one administration versus another. This is a number of reduction in staff going all the way back to the 70s. I think it reflected a lack of priority of antitrust, a lack of understanding of the way in which antitrust helps our economy, the way in which it helps businesses to compete, not get foreclosed by their enormously large competitors, the way in which it helps labor achieve wage increases without them being agreements against those, the way in which it helps consumers accomplish about ordinary life at reasonable competitive prices. I think what we've seen now recently, of course, is with the big tech companies and with the way in which the technology companies in many ways change what we see about antitrust, with network effects, with the two-sided platforms. These are all issues which were only recently coming into focus, and I think bipartisan focus. And
can I just ask you a quick, sorry, just on that subject, since my time is running out, to make the point, I mean, you're not just talking about the addition of lawyers, you're also talking about the addition of highly sophisticated forensic accounting systems that can actually get inside of companies and frankly, also, match the company's resources in court, correct? So this is not just about more lawyers.
Oh, no, you're exactly right, and particularly economists. So you're exactly right in all on that respect.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Case. This time, the chair recognizes Mr. Christ of Florida for 5 minutes to question. And you are muted, Mr. Christ. We are going to move on to Mr. Rupersberger of Maryland while Mr. Chris works out his technological issue. Mr. Rupersberger, you are recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you. Mr. Attorney General, first, I respect your career. I know you have a very difficult job to do, and this is clearly an area where we as members of Congress need to work in a bipartisan way to deal with most of the issues that you've talked about. I'm going to go local. I'm from the Baltimore region. I was a former homegrown Baltimore. My family has. I was a former prosecutor. And one of the things you started out with today was that it's so important when we have high crime areas and that we need a teamwork. And that teamwork, it seems to me, works a lot. It worked when I was a prosecutor. Federal, state, and local working together. The task force seemed to work together. So that's where my questioning today. We have another round. I hope to get into cybersecurity. This past week, the Department of Justice released their 5-year review of the Baltimore consent decree, which said Baltimore had made significant achievements. I appreciate that, but I've heard from residents throughout the Baltimore area, my constituents have said they haven't seen any of the reforms called for in the consent decree. Can you talk a little bit about the next steps, like how the independent monitoring works and possible recommendations that might come out of it? Now, what can the department do to help with the cost of compliance with the consent decree? Baltimore has a lot going for it, but affording the cost of complying with the consent decree and fielding a better trained community listen approach police is costly, it is very costly. And I'd appreciate your thoughts on DOJ helping with the cost of compliance or alternate ways to help with the cost.
We, Civil Rights Division is pleased with the progress so far with respect to the Baltimore consent decree. But as your constituents are pointing out, we still have considerable ways to go. In the announcement, I believe the Civil Rights Division identified a number of the areas that the independent monitor is continuing to work on. I don't have those in my head specifically with respect to Baltimore, but I can make sure our staff gets back to yours with respect to that. But this is a continuing set of improvements, and we're hopeful that will continue. With respect to the money for these kind of things, so take a step aside from Baltimore for just one moment. We've announced a series of different kinds of grant programs to help police departments with reform. These range from everything from technical assistance to assistance with respect to crises, to our intensive collaborative reform initiative, all of which provide money, and to the new laboratory that the Associate Attorney General just announced in California, and I believe the Baltimore Police Chief was there as well, with respect to money available for making the improvements that are generally required under decrees. So I can't give you a specific Baltimore specific answer. But again, on this one, I could have our Office of Justice Program staff get in touch with your office.
That'd be great. And a lot of the issues, am I muted? Yeah. A lot of the issues too are not yours, but a major part of the crime has to be. And I think you talk about social issues, schools and young children, and the conspiracies that are going on a regular basis. That's in your field. So we'll work with you. I think we're moving ahead, and I think this concept works. Federal, state, and local working together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruppersberger. And at this time, the chair is going to attempt to recognize Mr. Chris to the floor again, if he can get unmuted this time. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Mr. Chris.
Sorry about that. I thought I was coming later in the agenda, but I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, my colleague from Pennsylvania. Mr. Attorney General, it's great to be with you. Can you hear me okay? I can't hear him.
Can't hear me?
No, I can now. Okay, great. Well, again, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it. I really wanted to ask you about the former president and whether or not the Department of Justice has had an opportunity yet to look into his role in the insurrection and what his role was, if there's any criminal implication to it, if you've started to look into it, and if you could share that with the committee, I think the committee and the country would be grateful.
So the Justice Department has a long standing and I think very appropriate policy of not commenting on the existence or progress of investigations other than through what we say in court, at least in general, other than what we say in court and through the various filings and procedures that we make. And I'm afraid that has to continue to be my answer whenever I'm asked that question.
And why is that the policy?
Well, it protects this.
Respectfully.
Oh, that is a very appropriate question, and it derives from two different things. On the one hand, it respects the civil liberties and civil rights of Americans who may be under investigation to prevent publicity about investigations before filings are made, and prevents trial by publicity. And second, it protects our investigations. Our investigations often depend on us being able to develop evidence and facts as we go along without potential witnesses learning where we are, what we are doing. This, I do not mean this in reference to any particular investigation. This is our standard. This has been our standard as long as I have been involved in the criminal justice field, and I have been involved in that field for an extraordinarily long time, having been a prosecutor, having joined the Justice Department in 1979, and having been a prosecutor throughout the 80s.
Yes, sir. And thank you for your service. I'll add it at that juncture as well. Having been Attorney General of Florida myself, we would conduct, investigations and would sometimes be able to share it with the public and sometimes not be able to. So I certainly respect your answer, sir, of course. But I just think that, the country obviously is probably pretty curious about the question I posed to you. And again, I want to emphasize, I mean, no disrespect to you, sir, at all, or anybody. But I just think that, what happened that day and what the public at large does know through journalists and other media outlets about a lot of phone calls, a lot of text messages with the former Chief of Staff Meadows, I believe it was, have really, raised the level of concern about a sitting president potentially having participated, and it certainly looks like that's what happened, given the speech that he gave before they rushed up Capitol Hill on January the 6th, and to what degree and what level of concern should Americans have about a sitting president potentially being involved in something that came so close to taking down our democracy. I mean, to sort of mount a coup, if you will, from the White House is pretty strange stuff. I think we all can agree to that. But if you can't comment on it because of the policy you stated, I certainly understand it. And I have all the respect in the world for you, sir. I think you're doing a great job as our Attorney General. I would only encourage you to pursue what you believe is justice in the regard to the topic I'm addressing. I'm sure you will. You may already have. But I want to thank you again for being before the committee. And we want to provide to you, as I'm sure the chairman does, my great colleague from Pennsylvania, the resources you need to do whatever you need to search for the truth, to find the truth, and to bring justice to bear on those who deserve it. And thank you again for being, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Christ. At this time, the chair recognizes Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence of Michigan for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the 2020 presidential election, my hometown of Detroit and the state of Michigan as a whole was subject to outlandish claims of voter fraud that were, unsurprisingly, all proven to be false. As a result, dozens of so-called voter rights bills have been introduced in our state legislature seeking to suppress the right to vote of many of my constituents. Unfortunately, several states across the country has also followed that thread, even when there's case after case showing that there was no voter fraud, saying that they needed to protect the vote, and we still don't know what they're protecting it against. Resulting in the department filing lawsuits to protect the right to vote. Attorney General, my colleagues and I in the Congressional Black Caucus recently sent you a letter urging the Department of Justice to do whatever is necessary to ensure that every American has their right to vote and have their vote counted regardless of where they live. How will the president's budget empower you to do that?
I think the right to vote is the fundamental pillar of American democracy. Every qualified American should be able to vote, and we should do everything we possibly can to ensure that right can be exercised. The Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department is the unit responsible since the late 50s for ensuring the right to vote. We have asked for a more than 32% increase for the Civil Rights Division. I personally, from the very start, committed to doubling the size of the voting rights section, partly because we had lost the ability under Section 5 to pre-clear potentially discriminatory changes in voting practices and procedures. We have doubled the voting rights section, but we now need more money for the Civil Rights Division to do that. The specific request for the Civil Rights Division will increase the number of lawyers in the division and analysts in the division, and particularly including in the voting rights section.
Thank you. I am I'm the founder and co-chair of the Black Jewish Relations Caucus in Congress. I'm very active in addressing and trying to find ways to protect Americans from hate crimes. Last year, our caucus requested a briefing from the Department and FBI on the latest finding of hate crime statistics. Like many of my colleagues, I'm extremely concerned about the alarming rate of increase in hate crimes. How will the department leverage relationships with other federal, state, and local non-government agencies to address and combat the rise in hate crimes, and what steps can be taken to encourage enhanced relationships between the local and federal government as we continue our fight to protect Americans?
On the federal side, just for a moment before I get to the state side, we are asking for more money, of course, for the Civil Rights Division and for the FBI's Civil Rights Unit. to pursue these crimes. The FBI has elevated hate crimes and into the and civil rights violations into the top band of concern. Again, one of the very first things I did when I came to the Justice Department, because we saw the rise in hate crimes, was to review what the department was doing, and then launch a hate crime initiative, which coincided with the passage of the hate crime bill in that year, that summer. I appointed the head of the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division to be the coordinator in charge of the criminal investigations, and a woman in the Associate's office to be the department's overall coordinator with respect to hate crimes. Now, the particular topic you asked about, which is the way in which we can engage state and local law enforcement and communities. We've in the budget request, we've asked for $20 million in OJP grants, which is an increase of $8.1 million in additional resources. This money would, among other things, go to state, local law enforcement and community organizations for investigation and prosecution. We do need more outreach to the community. One of the problems with respect to hate crimes is sometimes people are afraid or otherwise unwilling to report hate crimes. So we have to improve reporting. One way to do that is through state hotlines, and some of this money can be used in that way.
Thank you so much. And we really need to pay attention to that. And reporting is an issue. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Representative Lawrence. At this time, the chair recognizes Representative Trone of Maryland, and it is the chair's intention to adjourn for the one vote, to recess for the one vote. We've been called to make one vote on the House floor. We'll recess after Mr. Trone's 5 minutes and then return in approximately 20 minutes. Mr. Trone, you are recognized.
Great. Thank you, Attorney General Garland, for joining us today, and Chair Cartwright, Ranking Member Adderholt, holding this hearing. One of my top priorities in Congress: ensure returning citizens have a job. Have a job is the key when they're released from prison. The data is clear. Best way we cut recidivism is a job. So to that end, Mr. Attorney General, I believe the Bureau of Prisons is too understaffed and under-resourced to fully implement the First Step Act. We spent a lot of time on this, and this is clearly the case. We hear stories after stories of case managers and support staff doing double duty as correctional officers, tremendous burnout, staff, inmates without vital services. So we believe BOP needs strong leadership from the top. The job is currently open. You have the opportunity to find a new director and turn this ship around. So if you could elaborate on the status right now of the leadership, future leadership at BOP, and how we can effectively then get that individual to move forward with the First Step Act.
Yes, so I don't want to go too far in detailing our personnel work, but the program for applying for the head of the Bureau of Prisons has closed. So we have all the applicants. They are under intense review right now. I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to announce the new director in the relatively near future. On the staffing question, I have to say I completely agree with you. And that's why our FY23 budget request seeks 1,300 new staff, 700 new corrections officers, and 600 for the First Step Act program that you were talking about. I'm also in complete agreement with you that an important part of fighting recidivism and easing re-entry is getting people a job. Both our department and the Department of Labor are asking for money, particularly $100 million for a joint Department of Justice, Department of Labor workforce initiative to have the Department of Labor help us in getting people jobs and getting them lined up before they leave custody. So I think all of the things you said, I agree with.
Excellent. In my company and private business, we've hired over 500 returning citizens, and we get a double-digit better number on retention rate. So these folks will take a second chance and succeed. And the job is what we have to stress with the new director of the BOP. Only 50% of the individuals in federal custody are completing or that are enrolled in programming that DOJ has determined reduce the likelihood of recidivism. What steps can we take to get BOP's funding again on programs that DOJ has said will reduce recidivism, but only less than 50% are participating in those programs that you've outlined?
So I'm not sure whether that number is still accurate. We issued a report under the First Step Act within the last month, which details the significant increases in the number of these evidence-based recidivism programs, which are now available because of the work we've been doing over the past year to make those programs available. I don't recall what the current participation rate is, but it is reflected in that report that was available. We are working very hard on improving those numbers, and the First Step Act money that we're asking for will assist us in that, as will the increase in First Step Act staff for Bureau of Prisons.
Another point would be great if we could have the BOP is directed by the First Step Act to help inmates obtain a valid government ID prior to release. It's one of the primary barriers of returning citizens from accessing employment, housing, public benefits. We frequently hear from employers and even BOP officials that this program is not running at the capacity which it should be running. We'd appreciate if you could take your staff and take a look and figure out how we get to 100% of our folks that are returning citizens have that government ID when they head out into the workplace.
Well, I would be happy to do that. We have institutes a program of working with the Immigration Customs Enforcement, the Government Publishing Office, Transportation Security Administration, DHS, to develop a federal ID for inmates who are unable to obtain state-issued ID. And we've drafted an interagency agreement between the Bureau of Prisons and the Marshals that includes language allowing prisoners to maintain personal identification upon transport, and therefore their state IDs upon their transfer to facilities, so we don't have to start all over again after they've re-entered. But I think your point that we need to increase the percentage who are able to get that identification is fundamental to be able to operate in our society nowadays.
Well, thank you, Mr. Attorney General, very much. And please keep an eye on automatic expungement laws. Any dollars we can get to expunge automatically, the states are not keeping up with this. That would help folks get employment. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. And ladies and gentlemen, we will recess for 20 minutes to take the vote on the floor and return at 4:24 p.m. See you then. And we are gavelled in and reconvened. Now, Attorney General Garland, I want to pick up on the subject that Congressman Trone was just talking to you about, and that is the Bureau of Prisons. The FY22 enacted appropriation for the BOP included $195 million above the president's budget request to help maintain staffing levels, improve officer inmate ratios, and reduce reliance on the augmentation, which is a fancy word for fudging the numbers. And I think that's so important. I have federal prisons in my district. And I'm concerned about whether this is enough, what we're doing on a couple of scores. First, it's very difficult to hire people to be prison guards right now, to be correctional officers. There are other opportunities to go to work outside of the realm of incarceration work. But even within the job of being a correctional officer, there are other opportunities. For example, in northeastern Pennsylvania, we've seen correctional officers get wooed away by state prison systems that pay better, or even county jails. So I'm concerned about whether current salaries are competitive. I mean, I've heard particularly from the USP Canaan management and staff that it's very difficult to hire people. Billboards are not working. Job fairs are not working. People are going other places to get better pay. I want to hear your thoughts on that. And the other score is that there still is overcrowding. BOP's inmate population has fallen to 156,000 from its 2013 peak of almost 220,000. But that's overall. In particular categories, overcrowding persists, such as in medium and high security facilities, and that's according to BOP's request. Question is, will BOP be able to reduce this overcrowding in FY23 with the funding requested to ensure the safety of both staff and inmates? Because that's what we're talking about, keeping both the correctional officers and the inmates safe by making sure there's enough staffing. Go ahead, Attorney General.
Well, you're right. We're in a competitive marketplace. I want to say one thing about the augmentation, which I can't agree that it means fudging the numbers. What it means, and I'm sure you didn't quite mean it that way. It means using staff that are not officially correctional officers for some correctional officer tasks. They are supposed to be trained to be able to pick up on those tasks. But look, we would rather that not be the case. We'd rather have more correctional officers. So in the first 6 months of FY22, the documented augmentation hours decreased by 15.1% compared to FY20 and to FY21. So we are definitely making considerable progress in that regard. It's not as good as it should be. Since January 1st, we've hired 300 new staff, including 236 correctional officers. And as you know, we're asking for appropriations to add 1,300 new staff, 700 correctional officers, and 600 FSA First Step Act staff. The more officers we have, the better the safety issue that you're concerned about will be able to be protected. Now, we are offering official recruitment incentives in order to get people in, because you're right, it is hard to compete. We're also seeking from OPM direct hire authority, which would allow us to streamline hiring at 6 BOP locations. So I think we are not, you and I are not in any disagreement on this question. That's why we're seeking more people, why we're seeking more streamlining and efficiency in the hiring. more assistance from OPM to let us do direct hires, and more incentive pay.
Well, I thank you for that. And at this time, I recognize our ranking member, Mr. Adderholt, for 5 minutes of additional questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, good to be back. Good to have you again here, Attorney General. And let me just start out with a question that was an issue a few months ago that we've not heard quite as much in the news lately, but late last year, Congress and President Biden became aware that the Justice Department was negotiating settlements with certain illegals who were separated from their families when they entered the United States illegally. At this time, is the Department of Justice contemplating, or are they at this point negotiating any compensation for these aliens who have entered the United States unlawfully?
We are engaged in extensive litigation right now from migrants who are subjected to the family separation program, which came under bipartisan attack. But we're in litigation with them, and we are not able to discuss further since the matter's under litigation.
Okay. All right. Well, if you could keep us posted on that, because that is an issue that I think many members of Congress are very interested in. So what you can disclose to that to members would be very helpful. We know that current immigration court caseload stands at well over, and correct me if I'm wrong, but well over 1.5 million cases. But there's recent statistics that have shown that less than 17% of these cases originated as credible fear referrals. So in light of that, of those statistics anyway, it's hard to see how eliminating future asylum casework will have a significant impact on the flow of pending cases. And I think this one leads one to wonder if reducing the caseload is a mere pretext for a political decision. My question is, what other justification is there for giving up the department's authority to adjudicate these particular cases?
So I don't know about the number you're speaking of, unless what you're talking about is a relatively low percentage of people who claim asylum ultimately get it, and that plainly is correct. But those have typically gone through the immigration court system. The reason for the asylum officer rule is to streamline the process, to make sure that the officers who know the most about asylums, which is the DHS officers involved in asylum, make the first two determinations of whether there's credible fear and then whether they're able to prove persecution necessary to achieve asylum. We don't give, I'm not sure what, we don't give up adjudication. Somebody who loses can appeal in a streamlined process to the immigration judges. But we think that this will reduce, how long it takes for determinations of asylum and the ultimate removal from the current over 4 years. We're hoping it to be around 6 months. So that's the purpose of that. It's a combination of putting the first asylum issues in the asylum officers, and then a streamlined record for decision by the IJs. This is part of a series of moves that Executive Office of Immigration Reform have taken in order to speed up the process to reduce that backlog that you mentioned.
Wouldn't you agree, though, that it diminishes the value and the integrity of the role of your immigration judges and the immigration court system?
No, quite the opposite. I think it gives us a chance to have the immigration judges focus on the most difficult cases. We want to bring that. They are operating under a backlog that is almost, as a former judge, the idea of having that many cases on my docket would make me quite miserable as a judge. So I don't think in any way this reduce the importance and integrity of the immigration judges.
But don't you think it's important for the record to be developed?
Oh, I see. Yes. Well, the record is developed. So the way in which the record is developed is the migrant gets to put in whatever the migrant wants at the administrative judge level. At the administrative officer level. Then if there's an appeal made to the immigration judges, if there's additional information or new information that can be put into the record by both the Department of Homeland Security, which are the prosecutors in these cases, or the migrant. So it doesn't eliminate it, but it streamlines it, and it streamlines the amount of time they would have to build that record.
Okay. All right. I think my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt. This time, the chair recognizes Representative Meng for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask about gun trafficking. Last April, the president called for the release of a new gun trafficking report, which is welcome news because the public and policymakers have largely been in the dark when it comes to the source of illegal guns and the trafficking channels used to supply them. ATF used to provide cities with data and analysis on the source of illegal guns, releasing 50 reports that helped shed light on interventions to stop the illegal flow of guns. Do you know, or can you provide an update on when the report will be released, whether we'll be seeing concrete data and analysis on where these guns, illegal guns, are coming from, and a commitment to work with cities like my home city of New York to provide city-specific analysis?
Well, you're quite right. It's been a very long time since ATF has produced this kind of report. That's why we determined last year that ATF would get back in the business of producing these reports. I believe that they've organized this into sort of 3 volumes of report in order to get to the first volume out as soon as possible. So my understanding is they're using May as a target date, sometime in May, to produce the first volume of the gun trafficking report. The next one by the end of the year, and I'm not sure when the third one will be.
And then if I could also ask, community gun violence is a public health crisis that disproportionately impacts our Black communities, reflecting our nation's racial inequities and underinvestment in communities of color. The pandemic has also had a pronounced impact on gun violence in the US as homicides increase to record levels. This kind of violence undermines community confidence in safety, depresses economic recovery, and restricts community development and opportunity. President Biden's proposed budget includes $500 million in support for community violence intervention programs, $250 million of which would be dedicated to CVI work at the DOJ. Can you talk about the importance of community-based violence intervention programs in reducing gun violence and building resilience in our communities, and why it's important for both the CDC and the Department of Justice to be involved in this effort?
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about that. I've personally visited community violence interrupters in Chicago and in New York City. Indeed, extremely successful program in Chicago. The head of that, Eddie Bocanegra, is going to be in our Office of Justice Programs. Sometimes that's a good thing. You take somebody who's really successful in the community and then you bring him to Washington. But he's assured us that he has good replacements. These programs have been quite successful. The one in New York was also very successful in almost totally eliminating gun violence for a year or two. After they immediately started. These are basically, they bring in people who have been previously incarcerated and been involved in gangs and have wanted to go straight and wanted to persuade members in their community to do that, with wraparound services to help people stay in the community, stay away from the gangs and the crews, and stay away from violence, visiting hospitals so that they come across victims who might turn around and retaliate and persuade them not to do so. The University of Chicago actually did a study of the Chicago community violence interrupters and found in an amazing statistical random study between those who had the benefit of assistance and those who didn't, a material reduction in violence, particularly gun violence. So we believe these are effective programs. They have to be done. The question is, can we bring them to scale? But we can spread them across the country. And it's one more way in which we're trying to fight the scourge of violent crime in our communities.
Yeah, and I want to thank you publicly, Mr. Attorney General, for coming to New York City after two of our honorable police officers were killed, and just for visiting important programs like the one you mentioned, and also your team working so closely with us to address ways to decrease and eliminate discrimination and violence against Asian Americans as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Meng. At this time, the chair recognizes Representative Stephen Palazzo for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. Mr. Attorney General, thank you for joining us today. With the possible impending cancellation of Title 42, the border is at a breaking point, and we need to do everything we can to stop the flow of crossings. President Trump completed more than 400 miles of a wall along the southern border before he left office. This current administration halted the construction, costing taxpayers $72 million. Barriers are an absolute necessity and part of a comprehensive solution to the crisis at our southern border, along with additional personnel and using the technology that we have at our tools. The Justice Department's efforts are also crucial to addressing the southern border. Illegal immigrants who have crossed the southwest border are then released and managed to fly around the country while they await a trial hearing at a future date. Has your department done any work or investigation regarding these illegal immigrants connecting back to the cartels that ushered them across the border? Let me clarify. There's a lot of concern and speculation that the relationship doesn't end once the immigrant crosses the border, that they get into America and the cartel they paid to get them here then continues to use them as a mule or a spy to get dangerous drugs into our country.
So one of the first things I did last year was establish what we call Task Force Alpha, which is a task force of the border state U.S. attorney's offices, the criminal division of the Justice Department, and our federal law enforcement and state local task forces in those offices to work on the problem of human smuggling that you're talking about. At the same time, we set up offices in the Northern Triangle where some of that human smuggling is originating to go after these human smuggling networks and human trafficking networks. The DEA is, one of our requests before you right now is for $414.9 million for the DEA's counter-drug efforts at the border, which includes intelligence and enforcement against the cartels. As you no doubt saw, I did a press conference just within the last week regarding our successful extradition of the former president of Honduras to face charges for organizing and turning parts of his government into a narco state and enabling drug smugglers to move up through the United States. And he's going to be going to trial in the Southern District of New York.
Thank you. Was your agency provided any additional funding or support when Biden halted construction of the border wall and opened our border to incite a flood of immigrants?
Well, we have been asking for in each fiscal year money for our law enforcement at the border. And this year, we're asking for $2.1 billion, a total of 6,231 positions. This is just for the Justice Department, not for Homeland Security at the border. And I want to obviously be clear here that the principal agency responsible for border protection, CBP, is part of the Department of Homeland Security. So most of the requests for increased resources will be coming from that committee, not ours. But we have DEA, the Marshals, the U.S. Attorney's offices, ATF, FBI, our organized crime, drug enforcement task forces, our criminal division, and our detention facilities for the Marshals and BOP. Those are the areas that we're asking for money from this subcommittee for.
And lastly, in previous years, we have seen the DOJ shape its efforts by political party. What are you going to do to ensure that the Department of Justice, which is the Department of Justice for all, not for one party, stays unbiased and nonpartisan?
That is my mission for the Justice Department since the day I came. That's the only reason I agreed to step down from life tenure, to be able to ensure that the Justice Department is separate and independent from politics with respect to its criminal investigations and civil law enforcement investigations. That is my job. I talk about that every place I go among the U.S. attorneys. They get it. This is part of the DNA of the Justice Department. And I think that's the way we will continue our prosecutions and investigations.
Well, General Garland, thank you for your service, and please pass on to your law enforcement officers and others that they do honorable work, and we appreciate them, not just keeping us safe at home, but also identifying threats to our homeland. So thank you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzo, and the chair compliments you on your excellent headset, Mr. Palazzo. At this time, the chair.
Sir, I'm low tech over here. I apologize. We'll have that fixed before the next hearing. Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Case for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Attorney General, I asked you earlier whether your antitrust enforcement increase was one of the largest in the budget, and you rightly said there may be others, and I have found one that I wanted to ask you about, and that's that you are proposing an increase in your funding of the community-oriented police standards program by 118% above FY 2022 enacted to expand the COPS hiring program. And you're noting here in your testimony that that is for the purpose of supporting the hiring of police and sworn law enforcement personnel nationwide and the implementation of community-based strategies to combat violent crime. And so I assume that that is a response to the chronic and growing staff shortages in our police departments across the country, and this is the federal government's response to assist state and local law enforcement in essentially trying to return to a more full complement of law enforcement officers.
So it's a part of our overall response that I was describing to Congressman Garcia to the scourge of violent crime and the rise of violent crime. So we have a two-part response. One is with our own federal law enforcement, and we've asked for significant increases in our own law enforcement to fight violent crime. But we also believe that our involvement with the state and local communities is our best way of preventing and bringing down violent crime. And so the COPS hiring, which goes directly to fund the police departments, is a very important aspect of that. And you're right, that's a very large increase. But to be clear, it's not the only additional money that we're asking to fund state and local police. We've also asked for an increase for burn JAG grants and other things for our Project Safe Neighborhoods, which is our standard core of the way in which We work with U.S. attorneys, federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, and communities. There are grants in the Office for Violence Against Women, which will support law enforcement as well. And then we also have money in health and wellness grants and public safety benefit programs for police officers to help them do their jobs under the incredibly difficult circumstances they face.
Right. But the COPS program, just focusing on that in particular, because that's what you proposed to increase by 118%. I mean, that, just correct me if I'm wrong, that's not so much about hiring additional federal law enforcement. That's about assisting state and local governments with their own hiring and retention issues.
Exactly. It's not actually about federal at all. This is money that goes directly to states and localities for their police departments and to assist in their hiring for community-oriented policing. You're exactly right.
Okay, thank you. Let me just switch to your proposals to increase rather your Office of your Environment and Natural Resources Division, where you propose an 18% increase to focus on climate change and environmental justice. And I guess this just prompts the question, where does DOJ actually, where do you touch the climate? Why do you touch the climate change debate? I mean, I can see it if what you're doing is prosecuting on existing environmental laws for violations that are related to climate change. But where is there some other place that you are actually engaging from a climate change perspective?
Well, I think the principal engagement is the one you just said. Of course, we coordinate with EPA because the cases come from EPA, but there's, again, two sides to this. On the one hand, we are responsible for defending the EPA administration's anti-climate change programs. So whenever there's a lawsuit about an EPA regulation, which is oriented towards reducing climate change gases, we are the lawyers for the EPA.
And excuse me, sir, have those lawsuits increased in volume and complexity that you really do see a need to kind of beef up your defense capabilities?
Yeah, so as I said, I was a judge for 25 years, and in the part of the judiciary that reviews those specific kinds of lawsuits, and these come with each new administration. Each new administration promulgates new regulations. They come under attack, and there's a big increase then in the number of lawsuits. So we have a number already pending. There are EPA regulations pending, and we certainly expect those to happen. And then there's the affirmative enforcement side that you mentioned before, violations of Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, et cetera, that are related to climate change.
Okay, thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Case. And the chair recognizes Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Attorney General Garland, thank you for your time and your patience with us and the votes. Hey, I just want to touch base. We're having a hard time in LA County right now. We talked about the rising crime rates nationally, but in California, specifically in LA, we're seeing homicides up 12%, property crimes up 4%, violent crimes up, shootings up 9%. I try to make a point of talking to local law enforcement agencies and officers as much as I can, usually, 6 to a dozen a week within my district. Do you get a chance to talk to the lower level officers within local law enforcement agencies much, or do you not get that opportunity?
I do, and since you and I last spoke at our last hearing, I've visited every U.S. Attorney district in California, including Los Angeles. And every time I go, I insist not just talking to the U.S. attorneys, but to talk to, and not just FBI, DEA, marshals, and ATF, but all the local police departments and sheriff departments, because that
fantastic. Thank you for doing that. I think that's very important, obviously, to get the pulse on the ground. In LA, specifically, we're dealing with what is looking like almost irreparable damage from this defund the police movement. The sheriff's LAPD were in fact defunded to the tune of $100 million or so. Much of that has not come back. The Board of Supervisors has put in place hiring freezes. And we're seeing now our sheriffs specifically hitting about 80 hours of overtime a month, in addition to their regular op tempo, driving them into the ground. If you've been talking to them, you would have heard for sure the issues they have with early retirements. I know Chairman Cartwright, you mentioned frustration with hiring and how hard it's been to bring people into law enforcement and the prisons. I don't think it's cosmic. I don't think it's a mystery. We've mistreated law enforcement over the last couple of years, and we've disincentivized them to stay on the force. We've disincentivized new recruits to come onto the force, and now we have massive retention and recruitment challenges being realized in these major cities. I think this is the source of the crime problems that we referenced. We need to reverse this cultural trend of defunding the police and instead defend the police and back our blue, while holding the bad apples accountable, obviously, and we need to double down on that. In LA County, we also have this problem with our DA, this guy named Gascon. He's behaving like the Penguin from Gotham City almost in Batman movies. He's almost enabling the bad guys to get away. He's choosing not to prosecute. He's choosing not to apply enhancements. And so I would encourage you to look at what's going on in LA. He needs to be reprimanded and anything within your control to help us within that realm. But I do want to touch on this overtime problem. We had an issue with illegal marijuana grows being led by the cartels with indentured servants, people who were smuggled across the border, manning these illegal marijuana fields in my district. You were very intimate with it. I want to thank you, first of all. Actually, we had a 3 levels of government cooperative engagement to help us eradicate as much as we can in LA County this illegal marijuana operation. One of the challenges we ran into, though, is at the federal level, there's a stipulation that says local law enforcement can't charge more than $19,000 a year of overtime to the federal grant buckets of money, right? And I think you're familiar with this. We did ask DOJ specifically through the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force Office for relief on that, because what we have in LA, besides a lot of folks hitting this overtime, is massive inflation. We're losing folks. So what was happening is these sheriffs would hit this $19,000 a year cap of overtime, and then they would be rotated out of the marijuana eradication team. We would lose that subject matter expertise and someone who had learned a lesson, valuable lessons over the last year, because they simply hit this artificial cap. It is an artificial and kind of a capricious cap being applied by the federal government. We asked for relief. Long story short is a year later, we get a response from OCDETF, the task force I was talking about, and they basically said, sorry, we can't do it. They literally said a standard national officer, state and local overtime cap is operationally and managerially optimal, meaning this is too hard. I implore you, sir, please help us remove this artificial cap. In LA, $19,000 a year doesn't do anything. We're short on cops. We're not short on crime. We have really major and serious problems with rising violent crime rates. We need to enable our officers. You don't support defund the police, right?
Take a look at our budget. You can be absolutely sure that we don't support defund the police. We're asking you for $8.2 billion in grants that we can give to the police.
Fantastic. That's music to my ears, Attorney General. I'm over time. But I just ask for all the assistance you can with helping us with this cap nationwide. Major cities like New York and LA, $19,000 is woefully anemic compared to what we have as needs right now, given our short staffing problems. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Ruppersberger for 5 minutes of questions.
Yeah, Attorney General Garland, my next subject matter that I want to discuss is cybersecurity. We know cybersecurity is a very serious issue, and it gets worse every day. We have a lot of good people and good positions that could work, and I think teamwork is really important here. Chris English, as an example, that I work with at NSA, and we have. I just met the new person today, the Secretary of CISA, but. What my question is just last week on 60 Minutes, both DOJ and CISA explained to the country about the imminent cyber threats posed by Russia against supporters like Ukraine. Putin, in my opinion, is weak, unstable, and profoundly upset about how his invasion is progressing. So now Putin has unleashed his cyber capabilities on any country that opposes his efforts in Ukraine. We know Russia has been probing a critical infrastructure systems that could do real harm and damage to the U.S. But it seems like Russia is no longer just looking to shut down a power plant or shut down communications. Cyber experts are now concerned that Russia is actively looking at ways at hurting people, and that includes hurting Americans. You recently announced some successes against Russia intelligence operations that could have created a hot net army that could have done real damage. Now, DOJ often talks about shutting the door on the bad actors. Now, Mr. Attorney General, we were then able to disable the GRU's military intelligence agency control over those devices before the botnet could be weaponized. Two questions. DOJ has a 1,000-person strong cyber division. What more can Congress do to help you fight cyber attacks that are getting more supplicated, that attack any vulnerabilities? How do we stack up person to person against Russia or Chinese state actors? And number two, can you talk about DOJ's evolving cyber strategy? I know previously there was an emphasis at naming and shaming, but has the strategy changed?
Well, I'll start with the last part, and then I'll move to the first. So what we succeeded in doing against the GRU, that's the Russian military intelligence unit, was to sever the connection between their command and control network and the thousands of hardware botnet that they had implanted the botnet control in. So they had used a similar arrangement of command and control over hardware devices to attack Ukraine. We don't know what this one was aimed at, but it could easily have been aimed at the United States. And we succeeded in doing this. We did this by getting court-authorized search warrants to seize the command and control nodes. So this is where we are well past name and shame now, although that remains part of the toolkit. But that's one good example. Another good example is the ability we've had to steal back the money that the ransomware actors have stolen and put in crypto wallets. We did that with respect to the REvil ransomware last year. So we have an array of different weapons we now have, of course, in coordination with our intelligence community partners. With respect to what we can do about this and what Congress can do about this, well, you can give us money. We've asked for more than $1.2 billion across DOJ to address cybersecurity and cybercrime. That includes an increase of $15.3 million for the U.S. attorney's offices to pursue malicious cyber actors and train cyber prosecutors, an increase in $88.3 million for the FBI for cyber threat response and cybersecurity, an increase in $115 million for our own cybersecurity across the Justice Department. And then in the first Ukraine supplemental that you did provide for us, we got $59.4 million in supplemental funding. We used a significant chunk of that to stand up the FBI's 24/7 cyber ops unit against Russia. So all of these are examples of things that you can do, but I think your overall concern is exactly right. Several months ago, right after the Ukraine invasion began, I addressed a group of members of Congress, I think mostly of the House, and warned about the increasing risk and threats of cyber attack by Russia. I think what you're referring to from the CISA and FBI discussion on 60 Minutes is only made further true what I had warned about originally. So we need to do everything we possibly can in this respect.
One of our biggest threats and security threats, when you're in law enforcement or in jobs to protect our country, national security, it's so important that we work together. I think a lot of this partisan politics is totally out of control. It hurts our country. And we really, in this area, we have to focus on the job. And I know you believe that. You were a former judge, you know how important that is. But we have to work as a team. And if I have anything to do with it, I'm going to oversee anything I can when I feel that there's any politics other than finding the facts and bringing justice and protecting our country and allies in this regard. So I have confidence you're the right person to lead us here, and just keep us involved as much as you can, especially in the area of cybersecurity, because it's going to keep growing, as we know, and we have to be on top of it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Ruppersberger, and I know the rest of us on this subcommittee feel very strongly the way you do on that subject. In the absence of Representative Lawrence turning her camera back on, we are going to conclude this hearing. Attorney General Garland, thank you for taking your time to appear at this hearing and to answer our questions. And thank you for your service to our nation in the Department of Justice. We stand ready, willing, and able to work with you to make sure you have the resources you need to make sure justice is enforced in the United States of America. With that, I thank our ranking member, Mr. Adderholt, and I hereby declare this hearing adjourned.